He only wanted a quiet lunch. But when a trembling 5-year-old boy approached Keanu Reeves in a McDonald's and whispered something no one else could hear, everything changed. Keanu's face went white, his hands shook, and within seconds he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. What that child revealed will haunt you until the very end. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The afternoon sun hung low over Los Angeles, washing the city in a soft, honey-colored glow. Traffic shimmered on the asphalt, and palm trees swayed lazily in the warm breeze. Keanu Reeves sat behind the wheel of his modest black Porsche, rolling down the window to let in the air that carried faint notes of ocean salt and street food. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and a faint trace of exhaustion softened his expression. For hours, he had been at a charity event for underprivileged children, handing out school supplies, painting with them, and listening to their stories. He had laughed when they called him Mr. John Wick, and he had knelt down to look each child in the eyes, reminding them that kindness never goes unnoticed. Now, as the event came to an end, he felt that rare combination of fatigue and quiet satisfaction that only comes from giving something of yourself. The echoes of children's laughter still lingered in his mind, a melody of innocence that tugged at him. He turned onto Sunset Boulevard, noticing how the golden light reflected off the buildings, how the day seemed too perfect to rush through. He could have driven straight home, back to the stillness of his house in the hills, but a craving for something simple pulled at him. He wanted to feel anonymous for a moment, to sit among people, to eat something ordinary, to exist without expectation. As he passed a familiar stretch of road, near Highland Avenue, a bright red and yellow sign caught his eye: McDonald's. It wasn't part of his usual routine. For years, his meals had been quiet, often cooked at home or shared with friends away from the public eye. But today felt different. He smiled faintly to himself. Why not? Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was the idea of stepping into a place where no one cared about fame, where a tray and a paper cup could remind him of the normal days before all of this. He turned into the parking lot and eased the car into a corner space, away from the main doors. A few children ran past holding balloons, their laughter filling the air. Inside, he could see parents talking over coffee, teenagers sharing fries, workers in uniform moving in rhythm behind the counter. It was life in its simplest form. He shut off the engine, removed his sunglasses, and took a deep breath. For the first time all day, there was no schedule, no applause, no flashing cameras, just the hum of a city winding down and a man who wanted to disappear into it. He walked inside quietly, blending in with the crowd. The familiar smell of fries and grilled meat hit him immediately, stirring memories of road trips from his youth. There was something oddly comforting about it. A cashier greeted him with a warm smile, not out of recognition, but simple friendliness. He ordered a cheeseburger, black coffee, and a small order of fries. When the receipt printed, he thanked her by name. "Thanks, Maria," and took his tray with a quiet nod. He found a seat by the window, half hidden behind a tall plastic plant, and watched the sunlight ripple across the floor. The low murmur of conversation, the clinking of trays, the whir of the soda machine, it all felt peaceful. Keanu removed his jacket and rested it on the chair beside him, leaning back as if releasing the weight of the day. He took the first bite of his burger and smiled at its simplicity. It was greasy, salty, and oddly perfect. The warmth of the coffee balanced the fatigue pressing against his temples. For a few minutes, he simply breathed, listening to the sound of life moving around him. He thought about how strange fame could be, how it gave so much but took away the ability to blend into moments like this. Yet here he was, unnoticed, sharing space with strangers who laughed without realizing they sat a few tables away from one of Hollywood's most recognized faces. Outside, the sky deepened to amber, and car headlights flickered on. Inside, Keanu felt grounded, as if he had stepped out of the endless current of celebrity and into something real again. He glanced at the families around him, a father cutting nuggets for his daughter, two friends sharing stories over milkshakes, a mother soothing her crying baby. For all the noise, there was harmony here. It reminded him of what mattered most: ordinary people living their lives with small joys and quiet struggles. He didn't know it yet, but this fleeting peace was the calm before a storm that would shake him to his core. Somewhere in the background, a small figure at another table kept looking in his direction, clutching a broken toy car as if it were a lifeline. Keanu stirred his coffee slowly, watching the steam curl upward like a fragile thread. Around him, the world felt untouched by fame or headlines, just laughter, chatter, and the scent of fries drifting through the air. For a man who had spent decades surrounded by cameras and constant movement, this stillness felt almost sacred. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the low hum of the restaurant wash over him. Every so often, someone would glance his way, perhaps thinking he looked familiar, but no one approached. He appreciated that. It reminded him that beneath the lights and lenses, he was still just another man grabbing a bite after a long day. There was something beautifully human about the way life continued around him, unconcerned with who he was. As he finished his coffee, Keanu looked out the window. A father lifted his toddler high in the air, spinning him around, while the child's laughter echoed through the glass. A group of teenagers argued good-naturedly over who got the last fry. It all seemed so ordinary, and that ordinariness filled him with quiet gratitude. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tempted to check messages, but decided against it. For once, he wanted to stay disconnected, to breathe, to be. The golden hour sunlight spilled across his table, catching the glint of his car keys and the faint reflection of his tired smile. He didn't know that across the room, a small boy was watching him with wide, curious eyes that carried fear, hope, and something far more urgent than admiration. The minutes drifted by quietly, and for a brief moment, Keanu forgot the noise of the outside world. The faint melody playing from the restaurant speakers mixed with the chatter of families, forming a rhythm of everyday life that calmed him. He took another slow sip of his coffee and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. He had spent years moving from film sets to interviews, from airports to hotel rooms, always surrounded, yet somehow alone. But here, among strangers sharing small pieces of their day, he felt invisible in the best way possible. He smiled faintly as a little girl waved to him from across the aisle with ketchup on her fingers. He waved back, earning a giggle before she returned to her fries. The city outside glowed beneath the setting sun. Cars crawled by, their headlights beginning to flicker on. The day was folding into evening, the sky melting into soft shades of pink and gold. Keanu watched it all in silence, feeling the weight of gratitude settle in his chest. Sometimes, he thought, peace came not from grand gestures or perfect plans, but from the smallest, most ordinary choices: a meal, a smile, a quiet seat by the window. But as he leaned back and let out a content breath, something subtle shifted in the air. A presence, almost imperceptible, drew his attention. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a boy sitting alone at another table, no older than 5, holding a broken toy car against his chest like it was his only treasure. The boy's eyes, wide, uncertain, and strangely sad, were fixed entirely on him. Keanu straightened slightly, unaware that this quiet meal was about to change everything. The first thing that caught Keanu's attention was the faint scraping sound of plastic against the table. It was rhythmic, nervous, like a small heartbeat echoing in the background. He looked up from his coffee and followed the sound to a nearby table, where a young boy sat beside a man in an immaculate gray suit. The contrast between them was striking. The boy couldn't have been more than 5, with messy blonde hair that curled slightly over his ears and a shirt that was faded around the edges as if it had been washed too many times. His small hands clutched a toy car, the front wheel broken off and dangling by a thin thread of plastic. The man beside him looked out of place in the fast food restaurant. He was tall and lean, with dark hair combed precisely, and a watch that gleamed under the fluorescent light. His every movement was sharp, controlled. He sat straight-backed, scrolling through his phone with a focused expression, one hand resting on the table beside an untouched cup of coffee. The crease in his suit trousers looked as though it had been pressed moments ago. The boy's blue eyes flickered toward Keanu again, quick and hesitant before darting away. Then they returned, lingering longer this time. There was something about the way he looked, part awe, part desperation, that pulled at Keanu's attention. Keanu smiled faintly, offering a small nod, thinking it might help the child relax. For a moment, it seemed to work. The boy lifted his toy car and rolled it gently across the table, pretending it was still whole. But when the man looked up from his phone, his gaze was cold enough to freeze the motion mid-roll. The boy froze instantly, eyes dropping to his lap, shoulders curling inward. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. He had seen fear before on movie sets, in characters he'd played, but this wasn't acting. This was a child's instinctive fear, the kind that came from too many corrections, too many harsh words, too many moments of learning when to stay silent. He turned slightly, pretending to check his phone so he could watch unnoticed. The man leaned toward the boy and whispered something sharp, his lips barely moving. The boy nodded quickly, eyes wide, then tried to look busy by fiddling with the broken wheel. The scene unsettled Keanu. The man's body language wasn't affectionate. It was controlling. His hand hovered near the boy's shoulder, not in comfort, but in warning. Keanu told himself not to overthink it. Maybe it was just a bad moment, a tired parent, a scolding for something harmless. But something about the dynamic didn't fit. The boy's quietness wasn't guilt, it was fear. A few tables away, laughter erupted from a group of teenagers, pulling Keanu back to the sounds of normal life. Yet his attention stayed fixed on the boy, on that broken toy car moving back and forth in silence. There was a story behind it. He could feel it, and that story was about to pull him into something far beyond a casual meal. Keanu tried to return to his meal, but something about that table refused to fade from his mind. The sound of the boy's toy scraping the surface had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. Every so often, Keanu caught the child sneaking another glance at him quick, almost pleading. But every time those blue eyes met his, they shifted downward in fear, like the boy had done something terribly wrong just by looking. The man in the gray suit didn't speak often, but when he did, the words came, out clipped and controlled. He seemed more interested in his phone than in the child sitting beside him, but his presence loomed heavy. He was the kind of man whose silence said more than his speech ever could. When the boy shifted in his chair, the man's gaze darted over just a fraction of a second, but sharp enough to make the child freeze again. Keanu's instincts stirred. Years of playing heroes on screen had taught him how to recognize real tension when it unfolded in front of him. There was a difference between discipline and domination, and what he saw looked far too much like the latter. He tried not to stare, not to draw attention, but his heart tugged him to stay alert. The child's posture said everything, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes darting between his toy and the man, hands fidgeting in nervous repetition. The toy car rolled forward, stopped, rolled back, and paused again. It was more than play, it was distraction. Keanu could sense that this was the boy's small refuge from something he didn't know how to explain. He took another sip of his coffee, eyes lowering to hide his observation. Part of him wanted to step in, but another part knew he had no reason yet. For now, all he could do was watch and wait. Outside, a car horn blared, momentarily breaking the restaurant's calm. The boy flinched slightly, and the man sighed in irritation, rubbing his temple as if even the smallest sound offended him. He muttered something under his breath too low for Keanu to hear, but the tone was sharp enough to make the boy nod quickly, his small hands clutching the toy tighter. Keanu felt a faint ache deep in his chest. The sight of the boy's trembling fingers reminded him of his own childhood, of those early years when uncertainty hung heavy in the air, when adults argued behind closed doors and a child learned to stay quiet to survive. He'd buried those memories long ago, but moments like this brought them back to life. When the man's phone rang, the boy's shoulders tensed again. The man picked it up, turning slightly away from the table, his voice dropping into a cold, businesslike tone. Keanu watched the boy's eyes flick toward him once more, full of something that went beyond fear, something closer to hope. The connection was silent, but real. Keanu straightened in his seat. Something about this moment was about to change everything. The man kept speaking on his phone, his tone clipped and irritated, while the boy sat perfectly still. Every few seconds, he ran his thumb over the chipped paint of his toy car, tracing the rough edges as if grounding himself. Keanu pretended to check a message, but his gaze stayed fixed on the pair. The boy looked so small against the hard lines of the booth, so out of place next to the man's polished shoes and pristine suit. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met again. The boy's lips parted, like he wanted to say something, but fear stopped him. His gaze dropped immediately, and Keanu caught the tiny movement of the man's foot under the table, an impatient tap that said everything without words. Whatever the boy's life was like, silence had become his only safety. Keanu set his coffee cup down, his mind running faster than his heartbeat. He wasn't the kind of man to assume the worst, but every instinct in him whispered that something was wrong. He'd seen that kind of fear before in fans who shared stories of surviving cruel homes, in strangers who trembled when talking about what they'd endured. It wasn't imagination, it was experience speaking to him now. The boy's hand trembled as he lifted the car again. The front wheel finally snapped off completely and rolled across the floor toward Keanu's table. It stopped near his foot. For a moment, the world around them seemed to blur into silence. Keanu reached down and picked it up gently. When he looked up, the boy's eyes were wide with panic, darting toward the man beside him. The man hadn't noticed he was still arguing on the phone, voice growing louder. Keanu turned the small plastic wheel over in his palm, then gave the boy a soft smile. The boy hesitated before giving the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough to confirm what Keanu already suspected. He slid the broken wheel back toward the boy, but didn't look away this time. Instead, he offered a kind of silent assurance, a promise that he was paying attention. The boy reached forward, grabbed the piece quickly, and tucked it back against his chest as if it were the most valuable thing he owned. The man ended his call with an exasperated sigh, setting the phone down hard. He glanced at the boy and muttered something sharp. The child nodded again, eyes down, gripping the car until his knuckles turned white. Keanu could feel the tension in the air now thick, invisible, and growing heavier with every passing second. There was no mistaking it anymore. Something dark lived behind the quiet at that table. And, as Keanu sat there, finishing his last sip of coffee, a decision began to form inside him. He didn't know what the boy's story was yet, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't walk away. The next moment would start a chain of events that would test his instincts, his courage, and his heart in ways he never expected. Keanu's instincts had always been sharp, honed by decades of watching people, studying expressions, and living in stories where small gestures revealed entire worlds. But this was no script. The tension at that nearby table felt real, unsettlingly real. The man's gestures were deliberate, as if every movement had been practiced for an audience. Even his smallest actions, like lifting the coffee cup or checking his watch, carried an unnatural precision. It wasn't just control, it was performance. Keanu could tell. The man's posture stayed too straight for someone relaxing in a McDonald's, and his gaze darted to the room's corners more than to the child beside him. That alone raised quiet alarms in Keanu's mind. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but his instincts whispered that this wasn't a parent-son lunch. It looked more like a man monitoring someone who wasn't allowed to speak freely. The boy sat stiffly, his small hands folded around the broken toy car. He didn't eat. He didn't even look at the tray in front of him. His fries had gone cold. When he accidentally nudged his cup, spilling a few drops of soda, his immediate reaction wasn't surprise, it was panic. He froze, then turned to the man with wide eyes, blurting a whispered, "I'm sorry." The apology was so automatic, so fearful that Keanu's breath caught for a second. The man didn't respond right away. He just stared at the wet table with an expression of disapproval, then reached into his pocket for a napkin. His movements were stiff, mechanical. He dabbed the spill carefully, his jaw tight. Then, without raising his voice, he said something under his breath too low to hear, but the tone was enough. The boy's shoulders hunched lower. Keanu leaned back in his seat, his burger untouched now. He glanced down at his coffee cup, using it as an excuse to watch through the reflection on the glass. He saw the man's hand rest briefly on the boy's wrist, not in affection, but as a warning. The touch was cold, possessive. The boy stopped moving completely. Every instinct inside Keanu flared. The protective impulse he'd felt countless times before, on set, in life, when strangers reached out to him for help, surged forward again. There were certain things that couldn't be ignored, certain looks in a child's eyes that told the truth more than words ever could. He knew that fear. It was the silent kind, the one that lived behind polite smiles and lowered gazes. He remembered being young and seeing that same fear in others' kids who didn't have the courage to speak, people trapped in situations no one believed. Fame had given him a voice, but it had also made him realize how many people had none. And now, at a small plastic table in a fast food restaurant, that awareness came rushing back. The man in the gray suit checked his watch again, impatient. His reflection glinted sharply under the light. Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly. That watch, that precision, that control, it all added up to one thing: dominance. And the boy beside him was its prisoner. Keanu watched as the minutes stretched into quiet discomfort. The man's tone never rose above a low murmur, but every word carried authority, an unspoken warning that made the little boy shrink deeper into the booth. The man leaned closer now, speaking directly into the child's ear. His face too close, his voice too calm. The boy's small hand trembled as he nodded again and again, whispering tiny apologies that vanished into the noise of the restaurant. Keanu's chest tightened. The scene before him was painfully familiar, too controlled, too rehearsed. This wasn't a father correcting his son. It was someone rehearsing dominance. The man's gestures were measured, precise, as if he'd practiced them in front of a mirror. When he finally leaned back in his seat, he adjusted the cuff of his shirt and glanced around the room, scanning for eyes that might be watching. His polished silver watch caught the light, flashing like a blade. Keanu followed the reflection, his pulse steady but heavy. Something about that watch, about the deliberate calmness of the man, unsettled him. It wasn't anger that scared him, it was control. The kind of control that comes from knowing exactly how to manipulate fear. The boy tried to reach for his fries, but his elbow brushed against his drink, tipping it slightly. A few drops spilled onto the table. The man's eyes flicked downward, cold and sharp. The boy froze instantly. "I'm sorry," he whispered, barely audible. The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence that followed said enough. Keanu glanced at the boy's face. It was pale, the corners of his lips pressed tight to keep from trembling. He kept one hand over the toy car, as if it were the only thing in the world that still belonged to him. Keanu felt the old ache of empathy stirred deep inside. He couldn't ignore that kind of fear, not in a child, not in anyone. He sat back in his chair, thinking, this wasn't a movie scene where he could simply deliver a heroic line and fix everything. This was real life. Intervening too early could make things worse. Doing nothing could be unforgivable. He needed to watch a little longer to understand what he was really dealing with. The man returned to his phone, his fingers tapping across the screen with impatient precision. The boy turned his head slightly, just enough to steal a glance at Keanu. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was searching, a plea without words. Keanu met the boy's eyes briefly, and something passed between them. Silent, but clear. Whatever was happening at that table, the boy knew it wasn't safe. And Keanu knew he was running out of time to decide what to do. Keanu leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, pretending to scroll through his phone. But his focus never left the boy. Every movement told a story. The way he flinched when the man adjusted his cuff. The way he froze mid-breath whenever the man's gaze landed on him. The restaurant was full of life, children laughing, fryers sizzling, but around that table the air felt heavy, suffocating. The man leaned closer again, speaking low, his lips moving slowly. The boy nodded, his hands trembling. Then he reached for a napkin and accidentally brushed against the man's arm. The man's reaction was small, but chilling, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a flicker of irritation behind his eyes. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he adjusted his watch again, tapping the table twice, as if sending a message only the boy could understand. The child straightened immediately. Keanu's pulse quickened. That wasn't parenting, it was conditioning. A waitress passed by, smiling politely as she dropped off a tray at the next table. Keanu noticed her pause slightly when she saw the boy's expression. Her eyes flicked to Keanu's, almost as if she felt it too that something about this scene wasn't right. Keanu gave the faintest nod, enough to tell her he'd seen it. She hesitated, then continued walking, pretending not to notice, but he knew she'd keep an eye on them now. The boy picked up his toy car again, trying to distract himself. The broken wheel dangled by a thread, but he rolled it anyway. Keanu noticed the faintest smile return to his lips, a small attempt to find normalcy in the chaos. But when the car slipped from his hand and landed on the floor, the man's head snapped toward him. The boy froze. The sound of the toy clattering on tile was loud enough to draw glances from nearby tables. Keanu reacted before the man could. He stood slowly, took a step, and picked up the toy car from the floor. His movements were calm, unthreatening. When he returned it to the boy, he smiled gently. "You dropped this, buddy," he said softly. The boy looked up, startled, then nodded in silence. He reached for the toy with both hands. For a moment, the fear in his eyes eased. The man forced a polite smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice tight. "Kids can be clumsy sometimes." Keanu nodded, matching the tone but not the intent. "Happens to everyone." He lingered for just a second longer, long enough to see the boy clutch the toy to his chest and whisper, "Thank you." That whisper was faint, but it carried weight. Keanu sat back down, his decision already forming. Something about this man, his rehearsed charm, his contained temper, the boy's desperate silence was building towards something dangerous. As the man returned to his phone, Keanu glanced at the boy once more. Their eyes met again, and this time, Keanu saw it clearly. The flicker of a plea. The unspoken request for help. He knew then that this wasn't just a feeling. Something terrible was hiding behind those polite smiles. And whatever it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. The quiet tension that had hung between those tables finally broke with a small, fragile sound, the scrape of a chair leg against the tile. Keanu looked up just as the boy slid down from his seat, clutching the broken toy car tightly against his chest. His small sneakers squeaked faintly on the floor as he hesitated, glancing once over his shoulder. The man in the gray suit was still focused on his phone, his voice low and clipped, unaware for the moment that the boy had moved. Keanu's breath stilled. Something about the boy's movements wasn't playful curiosity. It was cautious, almost rehearsed. Each step forward looked like a risk he had weighed carefully in his mind. The child's shoulders trembled, but he kept walking. Around them, the restaurant hummed with laughter and the rustle of paper bags. But for Keanu, it all blurred into silence. Every detail, the gleam of the overhead lights, the rhythmic beeping from the fryer, even the soft squeal of the door opening for a delivery driver seemed distant. All that existed now was the boy's slow, deliberate approach. Keanu set his burger down and turned fully toward him, resting his hands on the table in plain sight, so the boy would know he was safe. He didn't say a word. He simply waited, his calm eyes offering a kind of quiet permission. The boy stopped beside his chair, the toy car still clutched tight, his small knuckles white with tension. Up close, Keanu could see how young he really was, 5, maybe 6 at most. His hair was slightly tangled, his cheeks pale under the restaurant's harsh lighting. His lip had a faint mark, not fresh, but not old either. He looked like a child who'd learned to hold his breath in places that should have felt safe. Keanu leaned forward just enough to meet him halfway. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, his tone gentle. "Did you drop something again?" The boy shook his head quickly, his gaze darting toward the man in the gray suit. The man hadn't noticed yet. His voice still droned into the phone, words sharp and precise. Keanu lowered his voice. "It's okay," he said. "You can tell me what's wrong." The boy hesitated, swallowing hard. He shifted his weight, glanced once more toward his table, then back at Keanu. His small fingers dug into the toy car until the broken wheel pressed against his palm. Finally, in a trembling whisper, he spoke. The words were too soft to catch at first. Keanu leaned closer, his elbow on the table, head tilted toward the child. The boy's breath quivered against the air between them. When he finally spoke, again clearer, more urgent, the words landed like a blade through calm water. Keanu froze. The color drained from his face. His pulse spiked instantly, not with panic, but with something colder, heavier. Whatever the boy had just said was not small, not childish, not imagined. It was a truth no 5-year-old should ever have to say. He straightened slightly, eyes flicking toward the man in the gray suit. The man had ended his call and was watching now, his phone lowered, his gaze unreadable. Keanu's heart tightened. He understood in that instant that this wasn't a coincidence. The boy's approach wasn't random, it was a desperate call for help. For a few seconds, Keanu didn't move. His body remained still, but his mind raced through the boy's whispered words on a loop. They were quiet, fragile, and terrifyingly clear. Whatever had been happening at that table, whatever fear lived behind the child's eyes, it was real. The kind of truth that didn't come from imagination, but from survival. He took a slow breath, steadying his heartbeat, forcing himself to stay calm. The worst thing he could do now was show panic. The boy's eyes were still locked on his, wide and trembling, waiting for some kind of sign that he'd done the right thing by speaking. Keanu gave a faint nod, the kind only a child desperate for reassurance would understand. It said, "I believe you." The man in the gray suit finally noticed that the boy was gone. His head lifted from his phone, his expression hardening immediately. He scanned the restaurant once, and when his eyes landed on Keanu's table, his jaw tightened. In that instant, Keanu understood the danger wasn't theoretical anymore. The man stood, his chair scraping sharply against the floor. Keanu kept his composure, though his pulse hammered in his ears. "It's okay," he whispered to the boy, crouching slightly so he was at eye level. "You did the right thing. Stay close to me." The boy nodded, clutching the toy car like a lifeline. The man approached with slow, deliberate steps, his smile too polished to be real. "Excuse me," he said in a measured tone. "I think you've got my nephew's attention." Keanu rose to his full height, moving slightly so the boy was behind him. His voice stayed calm, but his stance was protective. "He's all right," he replied. "Just came over to show me his car." The man's eyes flicked from Keanu to the boy and back again. "Ah, yes. He's quite attached to that thing," he said, forcing a tight chuckle. "But we really should be going." The boy took a small step backward, pressing himself closer to Keanu's leg. Keanu felt the tremor in the child's hand and realized this wasn't just nervousness. It was fear of what would happen next. "Sure," Keanu said lightly, keeping his tone disarming. "But he hasn't finished telling me about his car yet. It's got quite the story, doesn't it?" He turned his head just enough to catch the boy's eyes. "You said something important before. Can you tell me again?" The man's smile faltered, his mask cracking for just a second. He reached a hand forward. "Come on, Ethan," he said sharply, his voice suddenly lower, colder. "Now." So that was the boy's name, Ethan. Keanu glanced between them, reading the tension in the air like an open script. The man's tone carried more than authority. It carried possession. Keanu stepped slightly to the side, his movement subtle but firm enough to block the path. The man's fingers twitched, irritation flashing across his face before he forced the smile back into place. "I appreciate your concern," he said, "but we're fine." Keanu's eyes didn't leave his. "I'm sure you are," he said evenly, "but maybe he just needs a minute." The silence between them stretched thin, the noise of the restaurant fading again until every sound seemed to hang in suspense. The boy didn't move, the man didn't blink, and Keanu knew this was the moment everything could tip. The man's eyes darkened, though his voice remained calm. "You don't understand, Mr. Reeves. he said, lowering his tone so only Keanu could hear. He's tired. It's been a long day. He tends to act out when he's hungry. The smile that followed was thin and mechanical, stretched across his face like a mask that no longer fit. Keanu didn't flinch. He met the man's gaze, his calmness deliberate, calculated. "If that's the case," he said gently, "then maybe he should sit here for a bit. Let him finish his drink. You look like you could use a break too." The man's lips pressed together. "I don't need your advice on parenting," he said, the polite tone slipping. He extended his hand toward the boy again, palm open, voice colder now. "Ethan, let's go." Ethan's breathing quickened. His fingers tightened around the toy car until his knuckles turned white. He didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer to Keanu, his voice trembling. "I don't want to." That single sentence stopped everything. The hum of conversation seemed to fade again. Even the fryers and coffee machines sounded distant. The man's expression froze, the corners of his mouth twitching with barely contained rage. Keanu felt it immediately, the sharp tension of someone losing control. "Sir," Keanu said quietly, his tone still steady, "you should lower your voice. People are watching." He wasn't bluffing. A few tables away, a couple had turned their heads. The waitress from earlier, Maya, lingered near the counter, eyes flicking between the three of them. She looked nervous, but alert. The man's forced composure cracked for a second. He inhaled through his nose and straightened his jacket. "Fine," he said tightly. "We'll do this your way." He turned and walked back toward their table, grabbing his phone again, as if to make a call. Keanu lowered his voice to Ethan. "You're safe right here, okay? I'm not going anywhere." Ethan nodded weakly. His voice barely escaped his throat. He said, "If I told anyone, he'd hurt her." Keanu's stomach turned to ice. "Her?" he asked softly. "Who?" "Ethan." The boy's lips trembled. "My mom." That was all Keanu needed to hear. The air in the restaurant thickened as the reality set in. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a cry for help. And the man sitting a few tables away wasn't a relative watching a child. He was something much darker. Keanu's hand went instinctively to his pocket. His fingers brushed his phone, the screen lighting up under his thumb. He didn't hesitate. He opened the emergency dial pad. The decision was instant, clear, and absolute. As the man looked up from his phone, their eyes met again. A quiet war passed between them, no words, no gestures, just an unspoken awareness that everything had changed. Keanu pressed the call button. His calm voice broke the silence. "Yes, this is Keanu Reeves. I need to report something immediately." The moment the boy whispered those words, Keanu felt his pulse slow, then thunder all at once. It was as if the air itself had thickened, every sound around them muffled by the gravity of what he'd just heard. His mind tried to make sense of it, but the truth was too clear to doubt. There was danger immediate, human, and sitting only a few feet away. He forced his breath to steady, keeping his expression soft for the boy's sake. He didn't want to scare him further, not when the child already looked like fear had been his only language for weeks. But inside, Keanu's instincts were shifting fast, every part of him sharpening. The man in the gray suit, now clearly watching, had lowered his phone, his conversation over. His eyes were locked on them, lips pressed into a thin, knowing line, his posture stiff with irritation. He wasn't pretending anymore. He didn't need to. Keanu could feel the hostility radiating off him like heat. He turned slightly toward the boy, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. "What's your name?" The boy's hand tightened around the toy car, his knuckles white. "Eli," he murmured, voice trembling. Keanu gave a faint nod. "Okay, Eli," he said softly. "You're safe right now. I promise you that." The boy's eyes glistened, filled with both hope and disbelief. Keanu could see that trust didn't come easily to him, but whatever had brought him across that room had taken every ounce of courage he had left. That alone told Keanu everything he needed to know. He kept his voice calm, soothing, but his mind was already calculating. He couldn't confront the man directly, not yet. He couldn't scare Eli back into silence. He needed to act quietly, quickly, and with precision. The man adjusted his tie, pretending to check his watch again. But Keanu caught the twitch in his jaw. He knew he was being watched now. The roles had reversed. Even if the man didn't realize it yet, Keanu rested one arm casually on the table, fingers brushing against his phone beneath it. He slid it open with a subtle movement. The screen glowed faintly against the wood, the emergency numbers ready. He leaned closer to Eli, voice low and even. "You did the right thing," he whispered. "You're very brave, okay? I'm going to help you." The boy looked up, his voice barely a breath. You believe me?" "I do," Keanu said. "And you're not alone anymore." He looked past Eli's shoulder again, just for a second to confirm what he already knew. The man hadn't stopped staring. He was still, but his eyes followed every word, every gesture, every inch of movement. Keanu exhaled slowly, grounding himself in that single truth. This wasn't a scene to be acted. It was a moment that could decide whether a child lived in fear another day or finally found safety. He tightened his grip on the phone, his thumb hovering above the screen. His decision wasn't hesitation. It was instinct. Then he pressed 911. The faint vibration of the phone buzzed under Keanu's hand, hidden beneath the table. His thumb pressed the final digit, and the screen lit up with the red emergency icon. He brought the phone close to his leg, angled away from sight, his voice dropping to the softest whisper possible. 911, what's your emergency?" Came the quiet, professional tone through the speaker. Keanu's jaw tightened. "This is Keanu Reeves. I'm at the McDonald's on Highland Avenue, Los Angeles," he murmured, keeping his tone calm but steady. "There's a child here. He just told me his mother's in danger. The man with him, he's not his father. I think he's threatening them." He felt the boy's small fingers tug at his sleeve, eyes wide with fear. Keanu nodded reassuringly, but didn't pause. "Stay on the line," the operator replied quickly. "Is the man aware you've called us?" Keanu's gaze lifted again. The man was pretending to scroll through his phone, but his jaw had stiffened, and his attention flicked toward them with unnerving precision. "Not yet," Keanu said quietly. "But he's watching. Send someone fast." He ended the call before the operator could respond again, not wanting the voice to draw attention. The entire conversation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt longer. When he slipped the phone back into his pocket, his pulse hadn't slowed. He looked down at Eli. The boy's breathing was shallow, his little chest rising and falling too fast. "Hey," Keanu whispered, his tone steady. "Look at me." The boy raised his eyes, trembling. "You're safe. Help's coming. You understand?" Eli nodded weakly, clutching his car tighter. Keanu straightened slightly, forcing himself to appear composed. His instincts told him the man could sense something had changed. Every move now mattered. He couldn't make him panic or run before the police arrived. The man stood abruptly, sliding his phone into his pocket. He adjusted his jacket with that same rehearsed composure, then took a few slow steps toward them. His shoes clicked sharply against the tile. Keanu shifted subtly to the side, keeping Eli behind him. "Everything okay?" he asked evenly. The man smiled, but it was thin, brittle. "My nephew has a bad habit of bothering strangers. I hope he hasn't said anything foolish." Keanu's eyes didn't waver. "Not at all. He was just showing me his car. It's a nice one, even if it's broken." The man's gaze flicked to the boy, who immediately dropped his eyes. "Come now, Eli," the man said in a tone that barely concealed the threat beneath. "We've overstayed our welcome." The child didn't move. His tiny fingers twisted into the fabric of Keanu's sleeve, seeking refuge. The man's nostrils flared. His control was slipping. Keanu felt it, the shift in power, the thin line between calm and confrontation. He lowered his voice again, careful, steady, controlled. "He's fine right here. Maybe give him a moment." The man's smile faltered completely now. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Reeves," he said quietly, leaning closer. "He's not your concern." But Keanu had already decided otherwise. The man's voice dropped into something darker now, every word laced with restrained anger. "You have no idea what you're getting involved in," he said, leaning closer across the table. His eyes had gone cold, the polished civility replaced with something raw and threatening. "This isn't a movie, Mr. Reeves. Stay out of it." Keanu didn't move. His calm was deliberate, almost unnervingly steady. "You're right," he said quietly. "It's not a movie. That's why it matters." The man's expression faltered for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected resistance, least of all from someone who radiated both calm and conviction. But before he could respond, the faint buzz of a text vibrated in Keanu's pocket. The message appeared from the dispatcher he'd just spoken, to confirmation that a unit was en route. Relief brushed against the tension in his chest, but he kept his face unreadable. He turned his attention back to Eli. The boy hadn't said a word since the confrontation began. His small hands clung to the toy car, the broken edge digging into his palm. His lip trembled, his eyes darting between them like a cornered bird. Keanu crouched slightly, bringing himself back to the boy's level. "Hey," he said softly. "I told you you're safe. Remember? Look at me." Eli met his eyes for the briefest moment, and that was enough. Trust, fragile but real, passed between them. Keanu nodded, the promise silent but absolute. The man straightened, glancing toward the entrance. "We're leaving," he snapped, tone sharp now. "Come on, Eli." Keanu rose with him, his calm presence an immovable barrier. "He said he doesn't want to," he replied evenly. "You should. Respect that." The man's control slipped again. "He's a child. He doesn't get to decide." Keanu's voice hardened slightly. "Then I suggest you start learning to listen." The exchange drew quiet attention from nearby tables. Conversation slowed. Forks paused midair. The waitress from before, Maya, lingered near the counter, pretending to wipe it down while her eyes stayed locked on them. She knew something was wrong too. The man took a step forward, invading Keanu's space. His voice was low, venomous. "You don't know who I am." Keanu didn't flinch. "No," he said, "but the police will in a few minutes." That made the man freeze. He blinked once, confusion flickering behind his anger. "What?" Keanu's expression didn't change. "You should sit down," he said calmly. "We don't want to cause a scene." The words landed with quiet authority, enough to make the man hesitate. His jaw tightened, but he backed away half a step. Keanu kept his gaze locked on him, every muscle in his body steady, protecting the small life trembling behind him. Outside, faint sirens began to echo through the city streets, distant, but drawing closer with each passing second. Keanu exhaled quietly, his pulse still sharp, his focus unwavering. He knew this was only the beginning. Whatever this man had done, whatever truth Eli had tried to share it, was about to come to light. Before Keanu could even slip his phone back into his pocket, the man rose from his seat. The motion was sudden, sharp, like someone flipping a switch from civility to control. He straightened his tie, adjusted the cuffs of his gray suit, and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His polished shoes clicked against the tile as he crossed the room with deliberate precision, each step echoing louder than the background chatter. "Sorry if my nephew's bothering you," he said in a smooth, almost pleasant tone. The voice didn't match the tension in his posture. It was too calm, too practiced. He can be overly curious sometimes. Keanu turned slowly, meeting his gaze with quiet steadiness. "Not at all," he replied evenly. "He just wanted to show me his toy car." His voice carried no challenge, only calm control, but his stance told a different story. He didn't move aside. He wasn't going to. Eli pressed himself closer to Keanu's leg, half hiding behind the chair. His small fingers clutched the fabric of Keanu's jacket. The movement was subtle, desperate. The man Harris, as Keanu later learned, glanced down and caught it. His jaw flexed. The false smile faltered for the briefest second before returning like a mask. "Well," Harris said quietly, "thank you for entertaining him. But we should be going." Keanu didn't move. "He's fine right here," he said gently, almost conversationally. He looked like he had something to say. Harris's smile froze in place. His voice dropped lower. "He said enough. Let's not make a scene." The way he said it, sent a chill down Keanu's spine. The words weren't a suggestion, they were a warning. The surrounding noise of the restaurant, the laughter, the orders being called, the rhythmic clatter of trays faded into a dull hum. Keanu stood, his movements unhurried, his face unreadable. He was careful not to look threatening, but made sure Harris understood one thing: the boy wasn't leaving. "I don't think anyone here wants a scene," Keanu said, "so why don't you let him finish his story?" The air between them thickened. Harris's expression twitched, a flicker of impatience breaking through his mask. "Look," he said, forcing a short laugh, "I appreciate your concern, but you don't know this kid. He has a wild imagination." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Or maybe he's finally found someone willing to listen." The line hit its mark. Harris's fake composure slipped, his nostrils flared, his fingers twitched at his side. For the first time, the control he prized so much began to crack. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a tone meant only for Keanu. "You're making a mistake. You don't want to get involved." Keanu didn't blink. "Too late," he said softly. Harris's expression froze at Keanu's quiet words. For a man who clearly thrived on control, being defied so calmly unsettled him. He adjusted his jacket again, a small, habitual gesture meant to reclaim composure. But his eyes betrayed him. They were sharp now, restless, calculating. "I think you misunderstand," he said softly. "This is a private matter. The boy's upset, that's all. He just needs rest." Keanu's tone stayed level, his voice low but firm. "Rest doesn't look like fear," he said. "He's scared of you." Harris's smile twitched, a shadow crossing his face. "You're an actor, aren't you? You see drama everywhere." The words were polite, but the insult underneath was clear. Keanu didn't take the bait. He kept his voice calm, his posture steady, blocking the narrow path between Harris and the child. Around them, the restaurant continued its rhythm, unaware that something dangerous was unfolding in plain sight. Only the waitress, Maya, noticed. From behind the counter she paused, tray in hand, eyes fixed on the quiet standoff forming in the corner. Harris leaned slightly forward, his tone turning icy. "Let me be clear," he said. "You don't know me. You don't know the situation. And you don't know what happens when people start asking questions that don't concern them." Keanu's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed kind when he glanced down at Eli. "You okay, buddy?" Eli's voice was barely a whisper. "Can I stay here?" Keanu nodded once. "You can." That answer drew a subtle ripple through the air, as if the balance had shifted again. Harris's polite veneer cracked completely this time. "You're crossing a line," he hissed, his voice low enough not to draw attention from nearby tables. "He's my responsibility. You're interfering." Keanu's reply came out calm, deliberate. "Responsibility isn't ownership." For the first time, Harris's composure broke. His hand twitched, half a step forward. Before he caught himself, Keanu moved subtly, his stance firm, ready to keep himself between the man and the boy. Their eyes locked, the space between them heavy with unspoken threats. Eli stayed pressed against Keanu's leg, clutching the toy car like a charm that might protect him. His eyes darted from one man to the other, terrified to even breathe too loudly. Keanu felt the weight of that small hand against his coat and realized just how fragile this moment was. Harris exhaled sharply through his nose, then straightened, forcing calm back into his tone. "You really don't know what you're stepping into," he muttered, more to himself than to Keanu. "Then explain it," Keanu said quietly. "Tell me why he's afraid." Harris looked away for a moment, his jaw flexing again, then forced a smirk that didn't match his eyes. "He's a child. Children imagine monsters where there aren't any." Keanu's voice dropped lower. "Sometimes they're just describing the ones they already know." The silence that followed was suffocating. The line had been drawn and neither man was backing down. The air inside the restaurant felt dense now, like everyone was breathing the same thin thread of silence. Harris stood motionless for a beat, his lips pressed tight as though he were calculating his next move. His smile was gone. Only his eyes moved cold, evaluating, dangerous. Then he spoke, his voice smooth again but sharper than before. "You've made your point," he said, "but you really should sit down. This is between me and the boy." Keanu didn't sit. His voice was calm but solid, carrying quiet authority. "Not anymore." Eli's breathing quickened again. The boy's small fingers gripped Keanu's sleeve, trembling. Keanu glanced down at him for just a second and spoke softly enough that only the boy could hear. "You're safe, Eli. No one's taking you anywhere." Harris noticed the whisper and stepped forward. "Don't talk to him," he snapped. The words were loud enough this time to turn a few heads from nearby tables. He immediately forced his composure back, muttering, "You don't want to embarrass yourself, Mr. Reeves." Keanu didn't look away. "If there's embarrassment here," he said, "it won't be mine." Maya, the waitress, was now lingering a few feet away, pretending to clean a counter, but keeping her phone in her hand. Her eyes flicked between Keanu and Harris. The quiet bravery in her face told Keanu she understood exactly what was happening. If things escalated, she would act. Harris leaned in close enough for Keanu to smell the faint trace of expensive cologne masking. Cold sweat. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he whispered. Keanu's tone didn't change. "I don't need to. I just need to know what kind of man threatens a child." For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Harris let out a low, humorless laugh. "You're a fool," he said. "You think a name makes you untouchable?" Keanu's answer was soft, but it hit like a strike. "No, I think doing the right thing does." That was the moment Harris realized control was slipping for good. He looked around, searching the room as if hoping someone would step in, but most of the diners had gone quiet, pretending not to notice but too aware to leave. The hum of the restaurant had turned into an uneasy stillness. He straightened his jacket again, the move almost theatrical now. "Fine," he said flatly. "If you want to play hero, go ahead. Just remember, when people like you interfere, someone always gets hurt." Keanu's expression hardened. "That's exactly why I'm here." The man glared at him for another long second, then turned sharply back toward his table, his footsteps clipped and angry. Keanu stayed where he was, every muscle taut, eyes fixed on him until he sat down again. The sound of distant sirens began to weave faintly through the evening air outside. Keanu caught the noise and glanced down at Eli. The boy looked up, uncertain, searching his face for meaning. Keanu gave him the faintest nod. Help was on its way. Maya had been watching from the counter for several minutes now, her instincts tightening with every glance toward Keanu's corner. She'd seen arguments before, parents scolding kids, couples bickering, but this felt different. The man's stiffness, the boy's silence, Keanu's steady calm, it was the kind of tension you could feel in your bones. Something wasn't right. She picked up a tray, pretending to clear a nearby table. Her movements were casual, practiced. Years in the job had taught her how to look busy while watching everything. As she approached, Keanu's eyes met hers for a split second. The faintest signal passed between them, just a look. Nothing more, but it was enough. She stopped beside his table, stacking a few empty cups from the booth next to him. "Everything good over here?" she asked lightly, her tone polite but searching. Keanu gave a small nod, then leaned slightly forward as if to thank her. His lips moved without a sound, but she caught it anyway. "Call help." Her pulse quickened. She didn't hesitate. She gave a small, deliberate nod in return, pretending to wipe the table as she moved on. The silent understanding between them was clear. She'd make the call quietly, away from view. But Harris had noticed the exchange. His sharp eyes followed her movements, suspicion flickering behind the practiced smile he wore like armor. "Mr. Reeves," he said smoothly, "I suggest you mind your own business." Keanu turned his head slowly, meeting his gaze. "When a child asks for help," he said evenly, "it becomes everyone's business." For the first time, Harris didn't try to hide his irritation. The corners of his mouth twitched, his jaw tightening. "You don't know what you're involving yourself in," he said through gritted teeth. "This is a mistake." Keanu's tone didn't change. "Maybe, but if I'm wrong, no one gets hurt. If I'm right, that boy's life depends on what I do next." The man's smile disappeared completely. His voice dropped low. "You're crossing a line." Under the table, Keanu's phone buzzed softly. A faint vibration against his leg confirmed what he'd been waiting for. The 911 connection had gone through, and the dispatcher was still listening in. Every word, every tone, every silence was being recorded now. Keanu didn't acknowledge it outwardly. He just rested his hands on the table and kept his posture relaxed, his voice calm. "Lines are funny things," he said. "Sometimes they're drawn by the wrong people." Harris leaned back, trying to regain his composure, but the effort showed cracks. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. Keanu noticed, every detail registering. The control this man had built his identity on was starting to crumble. And that, Keanu knew, was when people like him became unpredictable. Maya disappeared behind the counter, her movements smooth, but her hands trembling slightly. She grabbed the store phone under the register, glancing over her shoulder to make sure Harris wasn't watching. Her voice was low but urgent. "Yes, this is McDonald's on Highland Avenue. There's a situation here. A man with a child. The boy looks terrified. I think he's being held against his will. Keanu Reeves is here. He's keeping the boy safe." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way. Maya hung up quickly and turned back toward the dining area, her heart pounding. She forced a neutral smile when Harris's eyes met hers again, pretending to busy herself with organizing straws and napkins. Meanwhile, Keanu sat motionless, maintaining his calm, while Harris glared across the table. The air between them pulsed with tension. The sound of soda machines, the chatter, even the squeak of a mop somewhere in the back, all of it faded under the weight of that silence. Keanu finally spoke again, his voice controlled and deliberate. "You said he's your nephew," he said. "Where are his parents?" Harris didn't answer right away. His jaw flexed before he said, "That's none of your concern." "Maybe not," Keanu replied. "But if that child is afraid of you, it becomes everyone's concern." The man's tone sharpened. "You think a movie star gets to play savior in real life? You don't know what's happening here." Keanu leaned back slightly, eyes never leaving him. "You're right, I don't. But I know fear when I see it, and I know when someone's pretending not to be afraid." Harris's smile returned, but now it was twisted, brittle. "You don't know the first thing about me." "Maybe not," Keanu said softly, "but I don't have to. The truth's already written all over your face." Harris exhaled through his nose, sharp and impatient. His hand brushed the inside pocket of his jacket, just a small motion, but enough for Keanu to notice. His instincts spiked instantly. He shifted his chair a few inches back, keeping Eli behind him. "Easy," Keanu said quietly. "Let's not make this worse." "I'm not making anything worse," Harris said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. His eyes darted toward the counter toward Maya, who quickly turned away, pretending to refill a soda cup. The pretense was too late. He'd noticed her. Harris's glare hardened. "Who did she call?" Keanu's reply came slow, calm, and deliberate. "Someone who listens." For the first time, true anger flashed across Harris's face. The mask of composure shattered completely. He leaned forward, his tone low but dangerous. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." Keanu's reply was quiet, yet final. "Neither do you." Under the table, his phone vibrated again, a single pulse. The dispatcher had heard enough. Help was minutes away. Keanu didn't let his relief show. He stayed focused, his voice steady, his body a shield between a frightened child and a man unraveling. The hum of the restaurant had turned uneasy. Conversations dimmed as customers began to sense something wasn't right, though no one fully understood what was happening. Maya moved quietly between tables, her face calm, her heart racing. She kept glancing toward the front windows, waiting for the flash of red and blue lights to appear. Harris, still seated across from Keanu, leaned forward again. His voice dropped to a hiss. "You've made a serious mistake, Reeves." You think the police will believe you over me? You think they'll believe some frightened kid with a broken toy? Keanu didn't blink. They'll believe what they see, he said evenly. And right now, what they see is a man trying too hard to explain himself. Eli's small fingers gripped Keanu's sleeve tighter. His voice was barely audible. Is he gonna be mad? Keanu looked down, meeting the boy's eyes. Not at you, he said softly. You did the brave thing. You told the truth. The boy's bottom lip quivered, but he nodded. His trust in that moment was absolute, and it strengthened Keanu's resolve. Harris stood suddenly, pushing the chair back with a harsh scrape. A few people turned to look, startled. Maya froze behind the counter, one hand on the phone again. Keanu rose too, slow and deliberate, blocking the narrow space between Harris and the child. The two men stood inches apart now, one radiating cold fury, the other calm defiance. Harris spoke first, his composure completely gone. Move aside. Keanu shook his head. You'll wait right here. You're out of your mind, Harris spat. You don't know who I am. Keanu's voice dropped low. I don't care who you are. Harris's jaw flexed, his breath coming faster. The silence that followed felt electric. Somewhere near the back of the restaurant, a fryer beeped, breaking the stillness for a split second. Then, from outside, the faint wail of sirens drew closer, slow at first, then unmistakably near. Harris's head snapped toward the window. His shoulders stiffened as realization hit. The color drained slightly from his face, replaced by simmering rage. You called them, he said. You, Keanu interrupted quietly. Sit down, Harris. It's over. The man didn't move. His body was tense, his hand twitching at his side like he was fighting the urge to lash out. But the sound of the sirens was growing louder now, filling the space like a countdown. Maya stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. Sir, please, just sit down. For a moment, it seemed Harris might explode. But then he turned sharply, muttering something under his breath, and sat again, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. His composure was gone, his authority shattered. Keanu stayed standing, one steady hand on Eli's shoulder. Outside, flashing lights splashed across the glass as police cars pulled up to the curb. The child pressed closer to Keanu, whispering one fragile word through a shaky breath. Thank you. Keanu exhaled slowly. You're safe now, Eli. The moment the police sirens drew closer, time seemed to slow inside the restaurant. People began to murmur, confused but cautious. Harris sat rigidly in his seat, pretending to scroll through his phone, though his hand trembled slightly with the effort to appear composed. Keanu stayed standing beside Eli, his voice low, calm, steady. Eli, he said softly, kneeling so their eyes met again. You're safe here, okay? You can tell me what's really going on. The boy looked up, his small chest rising and falling quickly. His face was pale, and his lips quivered like he was fighting words he wasn't sure he was allowed to say. Keanu waited. He didn't press. He just gave the boy silence, the kind of silence that makes room for truth. Finally, Eli leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. He hurt my mom, he said, his words trembling like fragile glass. She's at home. She can't move. The sentence struck Keanu like a physical blow. His stomach dropped, his heart pounding so hard it almost hurt. But his expression didn't change. He couldn't let Harris, who was watching them from across the table, sense that anything had been said. Keanu's hand found the edge of the table to steady himself. His voice, when it came, was controlled and quiet. You did the right thing, he whispered back. You were very brave to tell me. Eli's lower lip trembled again. He said no one would believe me, he murmured, clutching the broken toy car to his chest. They will, Keanu said. I do. The boy looked at him, wide-eyed, trying to decide if he could believe that. There was a long pause before he gave a tiny nod. Keanu stayed crouched beside him, glancing discreetly toward Harris. The man's eyes were narrowed now, full of calculation. He knew something was shifting but couldn't tell what. His fingers tapped the table, slow, rhythmic, impatient. Keanu turned slightly, slipping his hand into his pocket under the table again. The dispatcher was still on the open line. He lowered his voice so softly that only the device could pick it up. "We have a child in danger," he murmured. "The suspect's name is unknown. The boy says his mother's been injured and left at their home." The dispatcher's calm voice came through faintly, almost inaudible to anyone nearby. "Understood, sir. Officers are on scene. Can you confirm your location?" Keanu took a breath and spoke clearly but quietly, his tone still even. "Highland Avenue McDonald's, corner booth near the north wall." "Copy that. Officers are moving in," came the reply. Keanu ended the call and slipped the phone flat against his thigh again. Every second now felt stretched thin, every breath heavier. The ticking of the restaurant's wall clock grew louder in his ears, steady and sharp like a countdown. He forced himself to look calm. His hand found the boy's shoulder. "They're coming, Eli. Just stay close to me." The boy nodded faintly, eyes wide, whispering one word through the tremor in his voice. "Okay." Eli's small confession hung in the air like a shadow that wouldn't fade. Keanu's breath caught in his throat, but he forced himself to stay outwardly calm. He couldn't risk drawing attention to the boy's words. Harris was watching, pretending to be absorbed in his phone, but glancing up every few seconds with eyes sharp as knives. Keanu crouched a little lower beside the boy, shielding him slightly from view. "Eli," he whispered, "when did this happen to your mom?" The boy's voice cracked as he answered. "Last night. He got mad because she told him to leave. He pushed her, and she hit the table. She stopped moving. I tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't get up." His voice faltered as tears welled up in his eyes. "He said she'd be fine if I didn't tell anyone, but she wasn't fine." Keanu's heart twisted. He had to steady his breathing to keep his hands from shaking. "You did the right thing," he said again, voice barely audible. "You were brave to come to me." Eli sniffled, his fingers tracing the chipped paint of his toy car. "She told me once," he whispered, "that if I was ever scared, I should find someone kind. You looked kind." Those words nearly broke Keanu's composure. He swallowed hard, pressing his hand lightly over the boy's to reassure him. "I'm here now, and we're not going anywhere until we make sure she's safe." At the far end of the booth, Harris shifted suddenly, his voice slicing through the fragile quiet. "What are you two whispering about?" he asked sharply. Keanu turned slowly, wearing the same measured calm that had unnerved the man all along. "Just talking about his car," he said. "He was telling me how it broke." Harris's eyes narrowed. "You think I'm stupid?" Keanu's expression didn't flicker. "I think you're nervous," he said quietly. "And you should be." Harris's face darkened, but before he could respond, the faint reflection of blue and red lights flickered across the window glass. The low hum of police radios seeped through the front doors. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Maya, still behind the counter, caught Keanu's eye and gave a subtle nod. He nodded back, relief flickering through his tense posture. Harris noticed the exchange too. His face paled. He stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "We're leaving," he said sharply, reaching for Eli. Keanu moved first. He stepped between them again, his voice calm but ironclad. "No, you're not. Move," Harris barked. Keanu didn't. "Sit down." The restaurant fell silent. Even the fryers seemed to stop hissing. Eli pressed against Keanu's leg, trembling, but this time, he didn't hide his face. He looked up at Harris, voice quivering, but strong enough to be heard. "You hurt her," he said. "You hurt my mom." That broke whatever illusion of control Harris had left. His mask shattered completely. But before he could speak again, the front door burst open and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Keanu took a deep breath, his steady hand still resting on Eli's shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're safe now." The police lights outside flashed faintly through the window, their colors reflecting off the golden arches of the restaurant sign. Harris noticed them instantly. His jaw tightened, his knuckles flexed. and his entire posture shifted into something predatory. He was calculating, realizing the walls were closing in. But instead of running, he sat back down. His phone appeared in his hand, the faint glow of the screen illuminating his face. Keanu watched closely. Every few seconds, Harris's thumb moved across the screen. He wasn't scrolling aimlessly. He was typing. The kind of typing that looked fast, focused, and deliberate. Keanu didn't need to see the words to know what was happening. The man was contacting someone, possibly to clean up what he'd done, maybe to arrange an escape. Keanu kept his composure, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily against him. He glanced toward the counter where Maya worked. Her movements were slow, purposeful. She filled a paper cup with soda, added a straw, and brought it over to their table with a calm, practiced smile. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said, placing the cup gently in front of Eli. The boy hesitated, glancing at Keanu for reassurance before taking it. "Thank you," Keanu said, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. Maya's eyes met his briefly. Then, as she turned to leave, she slipped a folded napkin under his tray. Keanu waited until Harris looked away before sliding it open with one hand beneath the table. The handwriting was small but clear. "Police 2 minutes out." A wave of cautious relief washed through him. 2 minutes. That was all he had to keep Eli safe to prevent Harris from making a desperate move. He looked down at the boy, who was sipping his drink but trembling slightly. "Hey," Keanu said softly, "that's a cool car you've got there. How long have you had it?" Eli blinked, surprised by the question. "Since my birthday," he whispered. "But it broke when he got mad." Keanu nodded, his face softening. "It looks fast, though. Bet it used to go really far." The boy gave a tiny, shy smile, his eyes flickering with a faint light that hadn't been there before. "It used to," he said. "I'd race it on the kitchen floor. Maybe we'll fix it again someday," Keanu replied. "Things that break can still be made new." Eli looked up at him, eyes wet but trusting. "You promise?" Keanu's voice lowered, calm and certain. "Yeah, I promise." Across the table, Harris set his phone down abruptly, watching them with that same false smile that barely hid his fury. "Touching," he said quietly. "But enough games, Reeves. He's coming with me." The words landed like a knife through glass. The boy froze, the small drink trembling in his hands. Harris's tone had dropped the pretense entirely. His voice was a command, not a request. Keanu stood slowly, his every movement measured. "Sit down, Mr. Harris," he said evenly. "It's almost over." Harris rose too, his smile vanishing completely. "You don't get to tell me what's over." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere outside, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. Harris's chair screeched against the tile as he stood, the sharp sound slicing through the quiet hum of the restaurant. Every head turned toward them now, parents with children, teenagers with fries halfway to their mouths, an old man stirring his coffee, all frozen in uneasy silence. The air thickened with tension, as if everyone could feel that something irreversible was about to happen. Eli pressed against Keanu's side, trembling. Keanu instinctively moved a step forward, shielding him without breaking eye contact with Harris. "You should sit down," Keanu said quietly. "This doesn't have to get worse." But the man was beyond reason. "You think you can stop me?" he snarled. "You think a name and a few cameras make you invincible?" Keanu's tone stayed calm. "No one's invincible, but right now, you're out of time." Harris's hand twitched toward his jacket again, the gesture small but unmistakable. Maya gasped softly from behind the counter. Keanu didn't move, but his eyes followed every subtle motion. He was ready. If Harris tried to run, to grab the boy, to lash out, it wouldn't happen fast enough. "Eli," Keanu said, his voice gentle, "stay behind me." The boy obeyed instantly, clutching the broken car so tightly the plastic creaked under his fingers. Then, Harris slammed his palm flat on the table. The sound cracked like thunder, making several customers flinch. "Enough games," he shouted. "He's coming with me now." Keanu didn't move an inch. His voice stayed low, even controlled. "You're done giving orders. Move!" Harris barked. His face flushed red, veins rising on his neck, his composure completely gone. The restaurant manager, startled by the shouting, began to step forward, but Keanu lifted a hand subtly, signaling him to stay back. "It's fine," he said, never taking his eyes off Harris. "The police are already here." For a fraction of a second, Harris froze. Confusion flickered across his face, followed by disbelief, then fear. The faint blue and red glow from outside grew stronger, flashing against the glass walls of the restaurant. Maya's voice was barely a whisper. "They're here." Harris turned toward the door, realizing the truth too late. His face twisted with fury. "You shouldn't have done that," he spat. Keanu took a step closer, his voice steady as steel. "You shouldn't have hurt them." The front doors swung open just then, letting in the cold rush of night air. 2 police officers entered quickly, hands at their belts, eyes scanning the room. The tension snapped like a pulled wire finally breaking. Harris's breath came fast, his body stiff, his control gone entirely. "Sir, one," officer called out. "Step away from the table." Harris looked around, desperate, searching for any way out, but Keanu blocked his path completely. There was nowhere left to go. Eli's small hand slipped into Keanu's, his voice barely a whisper. "You didn't let him take me." Keanu looked down, his calm returning as the officers moved in. "Nobody," he said softly. "No one's taking you anywhere tonight." Keanu rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and calm. The sound of his chair sliding against the floor was the only noise in the room. His eyes never left Harris, who now stood opposite him with a kind of nervous fury, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. "He's not going anywhere until the officers arrive," Keanu said quietly, every syllable precise and controlled. Harris scoffed, the sound brittle. "You're making a mistake. You don't know who I am." Keanu didn't flinch. "Doesn't matter," he replied evenly. "I know who he is, a frightened child who just told the truth." The boy, still clutching his broken toy, peeked out from behind Keanu's arm. His face was streaked with tears, but there was something else in his eyes, now a fragile kind of hope. The room had gone still. The families, who hadn't already left, were watching silently. Someone near the counter had begun recording on their phone, capturing the quiet tension that had swallowed the restaurant whole. The sound of distant sirens filtered faintly through the glass, growing closer with every heartbeat. Harris's composure cracked again. "You think you can stand between us forever?" he hissed. Keanu's voice stayed level, just long enough. Harris's hands clenched. The false charm he'd worn for hours was gone, replaced by the raw, exposed anger of a man who realized his control was slipping away. His next words came out like a warning. "You're going to regret this." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "If protecting a child means regret, I'll take it." For a moment, the 2 men simply stood there, locked in a silent battle. Harris's breathing grew heavier, his jaw tight. Then, in a single abrupt motion, he reached forward and tried to grab Eli's arm. The reaction was instant. Keanu moved between them, his body firm and calm, one arm outstretched to block Harris's hand. The motion wasn't aggressive, it was protective, unyielding, final. "Don't," Keanu said softly. But there was something in that single word that made the man freeze. Around them, people gasped. The faint sound of someone whispering, "That's Keanu Reeves," echoed from one corner, but no one dared to move closer. Harris stared at him, disbelief flickering across his face. "You're out of your mind." "Maybe," Keanu said, eyes steady, voice low. "But at least I can sleep tonight." The boy pressed closer to him, and Keanu placed a gentle hand on Eli's shoulder without breaking eye contact with Harris. His calm wasn't bravado, it was conviction, the kind that came from years of understanding what mattered most when everything was on the line. Outside, the faint sirens grew louder, now joined by flashing lights reflecting off the glass walls. Harris's confidence faltered again as he glanced toward the window, realizing what was coming. Keanu's voice softened, but carried through the room. "It's over, Harris. Sit down." Harris didn't move, but his jaw flexed as if he were swallowing his pride with the rage that came with it. Harris's chest rose and fell faster now, his breathing sharp with anger and panic. The once polished businessman was unraveling in front of everyone's eyes. Sweat gathered at his temple, glinting beneath the overhead lights. He scanned the room like a cornered animal, his gaze darting between the onlookers, the door, and Keanu's unflinching stare. "You don't get it," Harris muttered, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. "You think you're some kind of hero. You're not saving him, you're ruining everything." Keanu's tone didn't change. If stopping a man from hurting a child ruined something, then it's something that needed to be ruined. Eli's grip on Keanu's jacket tightened. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes stayed fixed on the man who had terrified him for days. For the first time, he didn't look down. He stayed beside Keanu, silent but defiant. The other patrons had stopped pretending to eat. Phones were out now, recording, documenting every second. The quiet murmur of whispers filled the air like a tide of judgment building around Harris. "You have no idea what you're getting into," Harris said through clenched teeth. His hand twitched at his side again, hovering near his jacket. "You're going to regret this." Keanu stepped forward slightly, enough to make his voice the only sound that mattered. "I've heard those words before. They always come from people who already know they've lost." The line hit harder than anything Harris expected. His face contorted anger, shame, disbelief, all colliding at once. "You think this is over?" he spat. Keanu nodded calmly. "It is. You just haven't realized it yet." The sound of sirens outside grew louder, echoing against the glass windows. Through the reflection, red and blue lights flashed rhythmically, painting the diner in streaks of color. Then came the heavy slam of car doors and the muffled sound of radios crackling to life. Harris's head turned sharply toward the window, and for a split second, his mask fell away completely. Panic. "Don't move," Keanu said, his voice low but commanding. Harris's eyes darted back toward Eli, a desperate gleam flashing through them. He lunged half a step forward, his hand reaching, but Keanu was faster. He shifted his stance, catching Harris's wrist mid-motion and holding it firm. The entire diner gasped. "Enough," Keanu said, his voice quiet, steady, immovable. Harris struggled, but Keanu's grip didn't waver. Years of training on set, years of discipline, steadiness, and control, all of it showed now. He wasn't acting, he was protecting. The restaurant doors swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their boots echoing across the tile. "LAPD," one of them called out. "Hands where we can see them." Keanu released Harris instantly and stepped back, his hands raised in calm compliance. "That's him," he said, nodding toward Harris. "The boy's name is Eli. He needs help." The officers moved swiftly. One reached for Harris, who didn't resist this time. His shoulders slumped, the last of his defiance dissolving into silence. Eli clung to Keanu's hand, his toy car pressed between them. "Is it really over?" he whispered. Keanu knelt to meet his eyes again. "Yeah," he said softly. "You're safe now." Outside, the nightlights flickered over the glass, and for the first time in hours, the restaurant exhaled. The glass doors of the diner burst open, and a rush of night air swept through the room. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence cutting through the tension like a blade. One was tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm but commanding gaze. His name tag read Ramirez. The other, slightly shorter, with kind eyes and quick composure, was Vega. The restaurant, once filled with anxious murmurs, fell completely silent. Even the hum of the fryers seemed to fade. Harris straightened instantly, his entire demeanor transforming in seconds. The fury that had twisted his face vanished, replaced by a slick, practiced smile. "Officers," he said, voice smooth, almost relieved. "Thank goodness you're here. There's been a misunderstanding. This man is confusing my son." Keanu didn't look away from him. He kept one steady hand on Eli's shoulder and spoke in a tone that was quiet but firm. "Officers," he said clearly, "please talk to the boy first." Ramirez's eyes flicked between the two men, assessing the scene quickly. He saw the tears streaking down Eli's face, the way Keanu stood protectively in front of him, the tension still coiling in Harris's posture, despite his polished tone. Vega stepped forward, crouching down so she was at the boy's eye level. Her voice was soft, reassuring. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said. "My name's Officer Vega. Can you tell me your name?" Eli hesitated, his tiny fingers gripping the toy car so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked up at Keanu, searching for courage. "It's okay," Keanu whispered. "You can talk to her." Eli swallowed hard, then said softly, "Eli." Vega gave a small smile. "That's a good name. Eli, can you tell me what happened today?" The boy's lip trembled. His eyes darted toward Harris, who was now standing completely still, watching him. The sight made him shrink back slightly. Vega noticed immediately and shifted her position so her body blocked Harris from view. Her tone stayed calm, steady. "It's all right," she said gently. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you." For a long moment, the boy said nothing. Then, in a whisper so faint the entire diner leaned closer to hear, he said, "He hurt my mom. She's at home, and she can't move." He said nobody can help. The words seemed to echo through the space, quiet, but devastating. A wave of stillness followed. The families at nearby tables froze, phones trembling in their hands. Maya covered her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Ramirez's jaw tightened, and he exchanged a quick, silent look with Vega. She nodded once, her expression turning solemn. Ramirez took a firm step forward, positioning himself between Keanu and Harris. His hand rested on his belt, near his holster, not as a threat, but as a warning. His voice came deep and steady. "Sir, stay where you are." Harris's smile faltered. "This is ridiculous," he said quickly, forcing a laugh that didn't sound like laughter at all. "He's confused. You can't believe a scared kid over his own father." Keanu finally turned to face him fully, his voice even. "Then you won't mind waiting while they find out the truth." Harris's mask cracked again. The confident smirk that had carried him through the evening began to dissolve under the weight of the officer's silence. His hand twitched at his side, like he wanted to grab his phone, but Ramirez's calm, firm tone stopped him cold. "Hands where I can see them." The command left no room for argument. Harris slowly raised his hands, forcing a shaky laugh. "This is absurd," he said. "You're wasting time. That man," he pointed toward Keanu. "He's overstepping. I'm the boy's legal guardian. Check any record you want." Ramirez didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed locked on Harris, sharp and unflinching. "We'll verify everything soon enough," he said. "For now, you'll stay. Right here." Vega kept her focus on Eli, softening her tone again. "Eli, honey, do you know where your mom is right now?" The boy hesitated, then nodded slowly. "At home," he whispered. "She fell, and she couldn't get up. I tried to wake her, but she didn't move. He said I'd get in trouble if I told." A ripple of shock spread through the diner. The people recording lowered their phones, their faces pale. Maya took a small step forward, her voice trembling. "Officers, please." This boy came in scared. He wouldn't even look at that man without shaking. Ramirez gave her a single nod. "Thank you, ma'am. We've got it from here." He turned slightly to Vega. "Radio dispatch. We need a team sent to the boy's home. Possible domestic assault. Female victim. Unresponsive." Harris snapped. "You have no right," he shouted. "You're making a mistake." Keanu stood firm, his voice steady but edged with quiet conviction. "No mistake. You just ran out of lies." The line landed like a weight in the air. Harris's face turned crimson. He took half a step forward, fury boiling over, but before he could speak, Ramirez moved in, his presence filling the space. "I said stay where you are," he repeated, this time louder. The man froze, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling with shallow anger. He looked like someone who had spent years controlling everyone around him and for the first time had lost control completely. Vega stood and placed a gentle hand on Eli's shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "You're very brave." The boy looked up at her, then at Keanu, and managed a tiny nod. "Can we help my mom now?" Keanu crouched beside him, meeting his eyes. "They're going to her right now," he said. "And you're safe, Eli. You did exactly what she'd want you to do." The boy's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't from fear. They were from release. Outside, the boy's eyes, wail of another siren rose in the distance, signaling the arrival of more officers. Ramirez looked toward Harris one final time, voice steady and resolute. "Sir, you're coming with us." And for the first time that night, Harris didn't argue. The moment the command left Ramirez's lips, Harris snapped back to life. "You're out of your minds!" he barked, his composure breaking for good. His once calm voice now dripped with venom. "That boy is confused! You don't understand, he's lying! This whole thing is a setup!" The words rang out too loud, echoing through the diner. But no one believed him. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the families who had been whispering earlier had gone completely still. All eyes were on him. The man who had tried so hard to sound reasonable now stood trembling, sweat collecting at his hairline. His hand twitched at his side, and for the first time, his mask of superiority slipped completely. Vega stepped closer to Ramirez, keeping her tone calm but firm. "Dispatch, this is Officer Vega. We need paramedics en route to the address the child mentioned. Possible domestic assault victim, unconscious female." The radio crackled to life with an acknowledgement. Vega's voice softened when she looked down at Eli. "They're going to help your mom, sweetheart. She'll be safe soon." Eli nodded, tears streaking his face. His little hands clenched tighter around the toy car, his knuckles turning white. Keanu knelt beside him, lowering himself so they were eye level. His voice was soft, steady, grounding. "You're safe now," he said. "They're going to take care of her. And you." The boy's small body shook with silent sobs. For the first time since entering the diner, he allowed himself to cry. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and stayed there quietly, letting the boy release what he'd been holding inside for far too long. Across the room, Harris was unraveling. "You can't. Just take my word against some child's," he snapped. "I'll sue every one of you. You'll lose your badges for this." Ramirez didn't even look at him. His calm was absolute. "Sir, you might want to save your energy for explaining yourself at the station." Harris's face turned red, a vein pulsing in his neck. "You think you can intimidate me? You don't know who I work with." Keanu slowly stood again, his voice still calm, but laced with quiet authority. "Doesn't matter who you work with," he said. "It doesn't change what you did." The man turned on him, eyes blazing. "You stay out of this. You've done enough damage already." But Keanu didn't back down. "You hurt people who couldn't fight back. That's not damage, Harris. That's justice catching up." For a moment, Harris's rage faltered, replaced by something close to fear. His breathing grew heavier, uneven. His gaze darted toward the exit, his body subtly shifting as if calculating a way out. Ramirez noticed instantly. "Don't," he warned, his voice cutting through the silence. "Stay where you are." But Harris was done listening. His legs tensed, and before anyone could react, he bolted toward the door. Ramirez moved with speed that came from years of instinct. In 2 long strides, he intercepted Harris, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back in a controlled, professional hold. The man shouted in pain, struggling, but the officer didn't budge. "It's over," Ramirez said, his tone calm but final. Harris grunted, twisting against Ramirez's hold, but the officer's grip was unshakable. The man's expensive jacket crumpled under the strain as he tried to break free. "You don't know what you're doing," he spat. "I'm not the villain here." Ramirez's tone didn't rise. "You'll have plenty of time to say that downtown." He kept Harris pinned with effortless control, his voice steady enough to keep the room calm. "Stop resisting." The man froze, chest heaving. For the first time, his voice faltered. "You don't understand," he said, almost pleading. "I was trying to protect him. She's unstable." Vega cut in, sharp but composed. "We already have paramedics heading to her address. We'll let the evidence speak for itself." Her words struck like a verdict. Harris's eyes flicked around the diner, searching for sympathy, but found only disgust. Even the onlookers who had once hesitated to interfere now looked at him with silent judgment. The thin thread of control he'd clung to snapped. Vega turned toward the booth where Harris had been sitting earlier. A black briefcase rested on the seat, half hidden by the shadows. "What's that?" she asked. Harris's reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, a flash of panic. "That's mine," he snapped. "Don't touch it." But Vega was already moving. She lifted the briefcase carefully onto the table, unlatched it, and opened it in full view of the restaurant. The air thickened with tension. Inside, beneath a stack of folders, lay several envelopes stuffed with cash, 2 driver's licenses bearing Harris's photo but different names, and a small leather notebook filled with addresses and coded notes. Ramirez leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Care to explain this?" Harris's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Sweat beaded across his forehead. His pulse was visible at his neck. For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing hard, eyes darting between the officers and the damning contents of the case. Vega flipped one of the pages in the notebook and looked up. "These addresses," she said quietly. "They're shelters, women's shelters." The realization rippled through the room like a shockwave. The diners gasped. Maya's hand flew to her mouth, and Eli's eyes widened. Harris's knees seemed to weaken beneath him. The facade he'd built, calm, control, authority, collapsed in an instant. Ramirez pulled his cuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for assault and endangerment," he said firmly. "You have the right to remain silent." Harris didn't fight this time. The strength left his body, replaced by the hollow emptiness of defeat. Keanu turned back to Eli, crouching beside him once more. The boy's tears had dried, replaced by an expression of quiet relief. He still clutched his toy car, the symbol of all he'd held onto through fear and chaos. "It's really over now," Keanu said softly. Eli nodded, whispering, "Thank you." Keanu smiled faintly. "No, Eli. Thank you for being brave when it mattered most." The diner's flashing lights faded into the distance as the police car pulled away from the curb. Keanu sat in the back seat beside Eli, who clutched his toy car so tightly it looked as though it might crack in half. The boy hadn't said much since they left. His eyes stayed fixed on the dark streets rushing past, the world outside lit only by the red and blue glow reflecting through the window. Officer Vega sat in the passenger seat, speaking softly into her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 17, en route to the address provided by the minor, requesting immediate medical assistance on scene." Ramirez drove in silence, his jaw set, his focus sharp. The hum of the engine filled the space between them. Keanu glanced down at Eli, noticing how his small hands trembled every few seconds. He reached over gently, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're doing great, Eli," Keanu said quietly. "We're almost there." Eli didn't answer right away. His voice came only after a long pause, small and uncertain. "What if she's not okay?" Keanu's throat tightened, but he forced a calm he didn't quite feel. "She's stronger than you think," he said. "And you were brave enough to get help. That means she has a chance because of you." The boy looked up at him, eyes shimmering with a fragile kind of hope. "You really think so?" "I know so," Keanu said, smiling faintly. "When we get through this, we'll fix your car together. Deal?" A tiny smile flickered across the boy's face, the first since they'd met. "Deal," he whispered. The cruiser turned onto a quiet residential street lined with small houses, most of them dark, except for a few porch lights flickering in the distance. Vega studied the GPS screen. "That's it," she said, pointing ahead. "Number 23. The car slowed to a crawl. Even before they stopped, something felt wrong. The front door of the small house stood slightly open, rocking gently in the night breeze. A light flickered from inside, dim, uncertain. Ramirez killed the siren and parked at the curb. "Stay in the car," he instructed Keanu, but the actor shook his head. "He trusts me," Keanu said quietly. "Let me help keep him calm." Ramirez hesitated, then nodded. "Stay behind us." They stepped out into the cold night air. Vega unlatched her flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness as they approached the house. The silence was heavy, too heavy. Not even the sound of crickets filled the air. The front yard was small, overgrown with weeds and scattered toys. A plastic tricycle lay on its side. The closer they got, the stronger the unease became. Ramirez reached the door first. He pushed it open with a slow, cautious hand. "LAPD," he called out. "Anyone inside?" No answer. The beam of his flashlight swept across the living room. What it revealed turned everyone's stomach. Furniture was overturned. A lamp lay shattered in the corner. Scattered glass crunched beneath their boots. A framed family photo hung crooked on the wall, its glass cracked. The image beneath showing a smiling woman and the same little boy now standing beside Keanu. Eli froze in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. His small voice trembled. "That's my house." Keanu knelt beside him, blocking his view just enough to soften the shock. "It's okay," he said gently. "You stay with me, remember?" Vega moved cautiously into the room, her flashlight steady. "Clear left," she murmured. Ramirez followed, scanning the adjoining hallway. "Kitchen's empty," he said. "Looks like there was a struggle. We need to move fast." The beam of Vega's light flickered across the floor, catching something pale by the coffee table. She drew in a sharp breath. "Here." Keanu turned instantly, pulling Eli close to his chest before the boy could see. On the floor lay a woman, her dark hair matted, one arm twisted beneath her body. Her face was bruised, but her chest moved faintly. She was breathing. Vega crouched beside her, checking her pulse. "She's alive," she said quickly. "Weak, but alive." Eli's knees buckled. "Mom!" he cried out, trying to rush forward, but Keanu caught him, holding him tight. "Wait," he said softly. "Let them help her." Ramirez's voice crackled over his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 17. We have the victim. Female, mid-30s, unconscious, but breathing. Send medics inside immediately." The next few minutes blurred into motion. The sound of boots against the floor, the crackle of radios, and the distant wail of an ambulance growing closer filled the house. Keanu stayed near the doorway with Eli in his arms, whispering calm reassurances even as his own heart pounded. Vega adjusted the woman's position carefully, keeping her airway open. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" she said gently, but the woman didn't respond. She glanced back toward Keanu. "He said her name was Sarah, right?" Keanu nodded. "Yes, that's her." The paramedics arrived moments later, rushing inside with medical kits. They knelt beside Sarah, attaching oxygen, checking vitals, working quickly and efficiently. One of them looked up at Vega. "She's going to make it. Pulse is weak but stable." The words hit Eli like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He began to sob, not the terrified kind from before, but the kind that came from relief. Keanu bent down and wrapped both arms around him, holding him close as the boy cried into his shirt. "She's okay, buddy," Keanu whispered. "You did it. You saved her." Eli nodded through his tears, his small voice muffled. "She's really gonna wake up?" Keanu smiled softly. "Yeah, she'll wake up. And when she does, she's gonna be so proud of you." Outside, the night air filled with the rhythmic flash of ambulance lights. Paramedics carried Sarah carefully onto a stretcher and out to the waiting vehicle. Vega followed them out, her expression easing for the first time all night. Keanu lifted Eli gently into his arms and stepped out behind them, the boy's head resting against his shoulder. the toy car still clutched tightly in his hand. The worst was over. For the first time since that quiet afternoon in the diner, the world finally felt safe again. The front yard pulsed with red and blue lights, casting the quiet suburban street in flashes of chaos and relief. Police cars lined the curb, their radios crackling with chatter. Neighbors peeked through blinds, drawn by the noise and the spectacle. Keanu stood off to the side near the patrol car, one hand resting on Eli's shoulder. The boy's eyes stayed locked on the ambulance where his mother was being tended to, his small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Harris was already in custody, his wrists bound behind him as two officers searched the trunk of his sleek black sedan. The man who had once strutted through the diner with smug composure now looked like a deflated shell. His tie hung loose, his hair damp with sweat. Every few seconds, he shouted something incoherent toward the officers, but no one paid him any attention. The evidence spoke louder than he ever could. Ramirez pulled open the trunk, shining his flashlight across the contents. Inside were several duffel bags, each stuffed with clothes, cash, and travel documents. "Looks like he was planning to run," Ramirez muttered. Vega joined him, flipping through a folder pulled from one of the bags. Inside were records, bank statements, fake IDs, and forged custody papers bearing both Harris's and Eli's names. She exhaled slowly, her expression tightening. Domestic abuse, forged guardianship. He was going to disappear with the kid. Ramirez nodded grimly. And judging by that notebook, not for the first time, he held up a smaller bag filled with envelopes, each marked with different state. Abbreviations: Nevada, Arizona, Texas. "He's done this before." "Across the lawn," Harris shouted. "You can't prove anything. You're framing me." His voice cracked halfway through the words, desperation leaking into every syllable. Keanu turned his gaze toward him but said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth had already spoken. His focus stayed on Eli, whose fingers were curled tightly around the repaired toy car Vega had found earlier. The little vehicle's cracked wheel had been gently taped back in place, its chipped red paint glinting under the flashing lights. Vega approached them quietly, crouching to Eli's height. "Hey, champ," she said softly. "Your mom's going to the hospital now. She's going to be okay. We'll follow her there, all right?" Eli nodded, his lip trembling but his eyes steady. "Can I ride with her?" "Not just yet," Vega said kindly. "But we'll be right behind the ambulance. You'll see her soon." Keanu gave a small smile. "You'll ride with me," he said. "We'll follow them together." The boy looked up at him, his trust absolute. "Okay." Vega stood and handed Keanu the small car. "He dropped this in the living room," she said quietly. "I think he'll want it when he sees her again." Keanu took it carefully, brushing his thumb over the chipped surface. "It's funny," he murmured. "Something this small survived everything tonight." Vega nodded, her voice low. "Sometimes innocence does." The night air carried a chill now, though no one seemed to notice. The chaos of flashing lights and murmuring officers wrapped the house like a cocoon of uneasy peace. Harris, handcuffed and trembling, shouted again as they guided him toward the back of a patrol car. "You think this ends me? I'll have lawyers! You'll all regret this!" Ramirez didn't flinch. "You've done enough talking for one night." He opened the cruiser door, guiding Harris inside. The sound of it slamming shut echoed through the neighborhood, like punctuation at the end of a long nightmare. Keanu stood a few yards away, watching the scene quietly. There was no triumph in his eyes, only exhaustion and quiet grief. He had seen too many people broken by cruelty, too many nights like this where violence left marks no court could erase. His gaze drifted toward Eli, who sat on the front step, wrapped in a blanket one of the paramedics had given him. The boy's face was pale, but his breathing had slowed. The toy car rested in his lap, its taped wheel catching the glow of the police lights. Vega walked over, wiping her hands on her uniform pants. "The medics," said Sarah's stable. "They're taking her to County General for observation." Keanu exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders for the first time. "Good. She's going to need time, but she'll make it. She will," Vega said, her eyes softened. "And that's because of you. If you hadn't noticed something was wrong, this would have ended differently. Keanu shook his head. It's not about me. It's about a boy who didn't give up. Eli turned his head slightly at the sound of his name. Is she really okay? He asked. Vega crouched beside him again. She's safe now, sweetheart. The doctors are going to help her heal. Keanu knelt next to her, his voice gentle. You were brave tonight, Eli. You protected your mom, even when it was scary. That's what heroes do. The boy blinked up at him, tears forming again, but this time, his face carried something new relief. Can I see her soon? As soon as the doctors say it's okay, Keanu said. Until then, we'll follow the ambulance. You won't be alone. Vega smiled softly and stood. We'll escort them. Ramirez is finishing the report. She glanced toward the police cruiser where Harris sat glaring through the window, his shouts now muffled. He'll be facing a long list of charges: domestic, assault, unlawful confinement, and attempted abduction across state lines. He's done. Keanu gave a slow nod, but there was no satisfaction in it. Only a quiet wish that this family could find peace after the wreckage. As the ambulance doors closed, the sirens flared to life again. Vega gestured for Keanu and Eli to follow her patrol car. Keanu lifted the boy gently into his arms, settling him in the back seat beside him. Through the window, Eli held up his toy car, watching its red paint shimmer against the passing lights. Vega saw it in the rearview mirror and smiled faintly. Looks like someone's going to need a new wheel, she said. Keanu glanced down at the boy, who was fighting to keep his eyes open. Yeah, he said softly. But the rest of it's still working. That's what matters. Outside, the lights faded as the convoy of vehicles pulled away, one carrying justice, another carrying healing, and one carrying hope. The hospital room was quiet, except for the rhythmic hum of machines and the faint whisper of air conditioning. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, painting soft stripes across the floor. Sarah stirred, her eyelids fluttering open for the first time in days. Confusion flickered in her expression as she blinked against the light, then slowly turned her head. Her gaze met a small figure sitting at her bedside. Mom? Eli's voice was a fragile whisper, trembling between disbelief and joy. Her eyes widened, filling instantly with tears. Eli! Her voice cracked as she reached out a trembling hand. Sweetheart, is it really you? He nodded and threw his arms around her gently, careful of the bandages along her arms. You're okay, he said through tears. I told them to help you. I told them everything. She held him tight, her tears soaking into his hair. You saved me, she whispered. You saved us both. Keanu stood a few feet away, quietly watching the reunion. His eyes softened, the exhaustion on his face tempered by a quiet relief. When Sarah finally noticed him, her brow furrowed in confusion. You, she said faintly. You were there. Keanu gave a small nod, stepping closer, but keeping his tone humble. Eli found me when he needed help, he said. He's the reason you're alive, Sarah. He's braver than most adults I know. The doctor entered just then, clipboard in hand, smiling at the sight before him. Good to see you awake, he said kindly. You're lucky. There were some close calls, but you'll make a full recovery. A few weeks of rest, some physical therapy, and you'll be just fine. Sarah exhaled, tears of relief spilling down her cheeks again. Thank you, she whispered, clutching her son's hand. Keanu glanced toward the window, giving them a quiet moment before he spoke again. The police took Harris into custody, he said gently. He's facing a long list of charges. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the words. When she looked back at him, her gratitude was written all over her face. I don't even know how to thank you. He shook his head lightly. Don't thank me. Thank your son. He never gave up. Eli smiled, still clutching his mother's hand. Keanu said we'd fix my car after this, he said, holding up the little toy. Its taped wheel gleamed faintly in the sunlight. Sarah laughed softly through her tears. Looks like he kept his promise. The doctor excused himself, leaving the three of them in the quiet room. Outside, the sky brightened into a clean blue, the kind of morning that feels like a beginning instead of an ending. For the first time in a long while, peace filled the space around them, fragile but real. Keanu glanced down at Eli and smiled. Looks like we've got a project waiting, huh? Eli nodded eagerly. Yeah, but this time we're painting it blue. A week later, the hospital's courtyard was alive with laughter, balloons, and a sense of renewal that hung gently in the spring air. The LAPD had arranged a small ceremony under a white canopy near the children's wing, where patients and staff gathered to witness something rare, an ending that felt like hope. Keanu stood off to the side, dressed simply in jeans and a dark jacket, hands in his pockets. He watched as Officer Vega guided Eli and his mother Sarah toward the small stage set up by the department. Sarah moved slowly, still healing, but her steps were steady. The bruises on her face had faded to faint shadows. Her eyes, though tired, carried light again. A captain from the LAPD stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Tonight, we honor courage," he began. "Sometimes heroes wear uniforms, but sometimes they're just 5 years old and refuse to give up on the person they love." The crowd clapped, some wiping away tears. Eli stood on the stage in an oversized blazer. The officers had jokingly lent him, clutching a small golden plaque that read, "Young Hero Award for Bravery Beyond Measure." His cheeks flushed as flashbulbs popped. He glanced toward Keanu, who gave him a quiet thumbs up from the back row. Sarah pressed a hand to her heart, whispering thanks to Vega and Ramirez. "You saved my family," she said. Vega smiled and shook her head. "He did," she said, nodding toward Eli. "We just showed up." After the ceremony, the crowd dispersed into smaller clusters, conversations soft and warm. Keanu remained where he was, content to stay out of the spotlight. He was used to it letting others take the stage while he stood in the wings, knowing the story's heart didn't need his name attached. Eli spotted him and ran across the courtyard, his tiny shoes slapping against the pavement. "You came!" he exclaimed. Keanu smiled. "I said I would, didn't I?" The boy held something behind his back. "I made you something," he said shyly. "With Mom." He handed Keanu a folded sheet of paper. It was a child's drawing two figures holding hands beneath a bright blue sky. One tall, with messy black hair. One small, smiling, with a red car beside him. Above them, in uneven letters, were the words, "My hero." Keanu's throat tightened as he looked at it. "That's us?" Eli nodded proudly. "You helped me fix my car, remember?" Keanu crouched down, meeting his eyes. "You're the real hero, Eli. I just made sure you didn't have to be one alone." Sarah joined them, her hand resting gently on her son's shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. You gave me back my life." Keanu smiled faintly. "You both did that yourselves." He looked at Eli again, his voice low and warm. "Take care of her, okay?" Eli nodded solemnly. "I will." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the courtyard lights flickered on, wrapping the small gathering in a golden glow. Cameras flashed once more, capturing a moment that didn't belong to fame, but to healing, to a boy who refused to stay silent and to a man who refused to walk away. Months later, Los Angeles had slipped into its softer season. The air was cooler now, touched by the first hints of autumn. In a quiet neighborhood far from downtown, the small apartment windows glowed with a gentle warmth. Inside, Sarah was unpacking the last of their boxes, while Eli hummed quietly on the living room floor, rolling his newly repaired toy car back and forth. The wheel turned perfectly now. The apartment was simple but peaceful, a far cry from the heavy silence of the house they had once feared to return to. Fresh paint covered the walls, sunlight filtered through the curtains, and laughter had found its way back into the corners of their lives. On the coffee table sat a framed photo from the awards ceremony. Eli holding his plaque with a shy smile, Keanu standing behind him, one hand on his shoulder. That afternoon, the soft knock on the door made Eli look up. His face lit up instantly. "Mom! He's here!" he shouted, racing across the small hallway. Sarah smiled as she wiped her hands on a towel and followed him. When she opened the door, Keanu Reeves stood there, holding 2 takeaway cups of coffee and a small box wrapped in brown paper. "Hope I'm not too early," Keanu said with his familiar modest grin. "You're right on time." Sarah replied, stepping aside to let him in. Eli nearly collided with him in excitement, tugging at his sleeve. "Come see! I fixed the track! My car runs all the way around now." Keanu laughed softly. "You did, huh? Let's see it." Eli hurried back to the floor, showing him how the little car looped around the plastic track and came back to the start. It clicked along with a rhythmic sound that filled the cozy room. Keanu crouched down to watch, genuinely impressed. "Looks like you've got a real engineer's touch," he said. Eli grinned proudly. "Mom says maybe I'll be an inventor one day." Keanu smiled. "She's right. You already fixed something most people would have thrown away." Sarah brought the coffees to the table and gestured for Keanu to sit. "Thank you," she said, her tone gentle but heavy with meaning, "for everything you've done for us." He shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. You did the hard part, starting over." She sat across from him, her voice quiet. "We couldn't have done it alone. The charity you connected us with, the apartment, the counseling sessions, you didn't just save us that day. You gave us a life again." Keanu's eyes softened. "Everyone deserves a place to feel safe. I just wanted to make sure you got yours." The box on the table caught Eli's attention. "What's that?" he asked curiously. Keanu smiled and slid it toward him. "Something for you." Eli tore it open carefully and gasped when he saw what was inside a small, hand-carved wooden car, polished to a shine, with his name engraved on the side. "You made this?" "I helped," Keanu said with a wink. "A friend of mine carved it, but the idea was yours. You reminded me how much courage can fit in something small." Eli traced his fingers over his name and smiled wide. "I'll keep it forever." Sarah looked between them, emotion welling in her eyes. "You changed everything," she said softly. Keanu met her gaze and replied just as gently, "Your son did." He believed someone would listen. For a long moment, the three of them sat in quiet reflection. The late afternoon sun spilled across the table, warming the coffee cups and filling the room with a sense of peace that felt almost sacred. Outside, the faint sounds of children playing drifted through the open window, the kind of everyday noise that once felt impossible for Sarah and Eli to imagine having again. Eli set his new wooden car next to the repaired one, aligning them carefully. "Now they can race," he said proudly. Keanu chuckled. "Two cars, one story," he said softly. "That's a good race to have." Sarah smiled at the simple words, but she understood the weight behind them. Every scar they carried, visible or not, had led to this moment of stillness. "You know," she said, "when I was trapped in that house, I used to think help would never come. But he believed someone would listen." She looked at Eli, who was too busy lining up his cars to hear the tremor in her voice. "He never gave up, even when I did." Keanu took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "Courage doesn't always look like what we expect," he said. "Sometimes it's just a whisper, or a small voice in a crowded place asking for help. Most people overlook that. But he didn't stop whispering, and that's what made the difference." Sarah's eyes glistened. "You really think one small voice can change everything?" He smiled faintly. "It already did." Eli looked up then, curious. "Will you come back to visit?" "I will," Keanu said. "You're stuck with me now." The boy laughed, the kind of laughter that breaks tension and replaces it with something whole. It filled the small apartment and seemed to wash away what remained of the past. As the day faded into evening, Keanu stood and walked to the window. The city stretched before him, quiet and golden under the sinking sun. "There's a lot of noise in the world," he said softly. "But sometimes, the smallest sound, the voice of a child, a plea for help, is what reminds us what matters most." Sarah stood beside him, following his gaze. "You've given us more than help," she said. "You reminded us there are still good people out there." He turned to her, his expression humble. "There always are. Sometimes we just have to be the first to listen." He said goodbye, not as a celebrity, but as a friend. When the door closed behind him, Sarah looked down at her son, who was carefully setting the two toy cars side by side again. For the first time, they weren't broken. The camera lingers on the quiet apartment, the repaired car glinting in the fading light, a symbol of resilience, of belief, of second chances. If you've ever seen someone stand up for a child like this, tell us in the comments below. And if you were in Keanu's place, what would you have done?